Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So, the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know, and feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support. So I don't know how many of you saw the incredible film Fire of Love, which is a beautiful film about this French couple who are volcanologists. That doesn't mean they're Vulcans from Star Trek. It means they love volcanoes. It tells this is a film that tells the story of these lovers who also love volcanoes. Or how many of you saw the film Navalny, which won the Academy Award? Fire of Love was nominated for the Academy Award in Best Documentary, and Navalny won the Academy Award for Best Documentary. Well, this is a conversation with the producer of both of those films and the director of Fire of Love. And here I'm talking about my dear friends, Shane Boris, who is the producer of both these films, and Sara Dosa, who is the filmmaker, the director of Fire of Love. We talk extensively, all three of us together, about the sublime elements of nature. And that's an interesting thing. I wonder how many of you think about nature or the environment, not just as a term or a category, but actually as a field of living beings, a field of elements. So we talk about the connections between science and myth, between physics and metaphysics, and even the power of a certain type of storytelling that brings to light the spectacular aspects of what we might call nature in a space of what one might call magical realism, which is a genre both of art, of literature, of filmmaking, and so on. This is a conversation we had in the spring of 2023. And just a couple other quick things about our guests. Shane, of course, has won an Academy Award, as I mentioned. He's Emmy nominated. He's a member of the Academy of Motion Pictures and Sciences, and has worked on Navalny, Fire of Love, as mentioned, and Emmy Award nominated Last Cruise, which is on HBO. Sara her film work really focuses on the human relationship with non-human nature, and has won a DGA Outstanding Director Award for Fire of Love, as well as the Critics' Choice Award for Best Archival Documentary and the Silver winner for Best Documentary. But these are just two remarkable people who I'm speaking to in conversation with one another and me, that really bring to light the power of the non-human, the power of storytelling, the power of film, and the power of reapproaching our lives and the world around us, the planet around us, with a little bit of a sense of curiosity and amazement and magic. Everyone enjoy this conversation. Again, Sara Dosa and Shane Boris.
So let me ask you each about your own practices as storytellers. Like, why do stories matter? What do they mean today? And how are you playing with the genre of stories?
That's a great question, and I think it's an answer that will always be evolving for me, and a question that I think I'll always interpret with new eyes and in different ways as I hope to continue my career as a filmmaker and a storyteller. But in this moment, I think that stories just have the profound power to expand horizons, to teach people to see with new eyes. And I'm particularly drawn to stories of people who I think are seers in ways that can offer insight into to perceiving and understanding ways of being in the world that perhaps might not be as readily accessible, especially in certain contexts. I think by doing so, there's the potential to kind of shift or recenter things that I believe are of political or importance, and also are deeply meaningful. And so I feel really kind of privileged to get to do this as a profession. And for me personally, largely the stories have to do with kind of the ways in which humans make meaning out of and with non-human nature. and in a way that kind of centers the sentience and the power of nature. And yeah, we're at a time of such incredible crisis that I believe that stories like this have the ability to kind of reshift understandings of nature in a way that I personally believe is very badly needed in this moment.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. How about you, Shane?
Yeah, I mean, everything Sarah said, ditto. And then I think also, I think it starts for me personally, just how I am moved in the world, and oftentimes that is through story and through the expression of one perspective or a confluence of perspectives, point of view. And there's data that shows that we are, as humans, like more moved by story than we are by data. But I could have told you that just from my experience in a way, that's what touches me and touches me deeply. And I think because of that, there's also this feeling inside, or an urge that the world is changing and new stories are needed to sort of talk about this changing world. And in order to tell those new stories, we need new ways of telling stories. And so for me, it's really important to look not just at the content of the stories we tell, but their form as well. And to do so in a way that's reflective and in communication and dialogue with the story that needs to be told.
There's something very profound that you alluded to there, Sarah, which is really at the core, and Shane, you kind of echoed it, that's really at the core of what this podcast is all about, which is opening up through the conversations I have with guests, a new way of relating to one another, but other beings, other forms of life, like really reopening the reality that we're all relational beings, and it's exactly what I'm working on right now in my own way by that. So let's kind of dive in there a little bit. So many different cultures and communities around the world, including some I imagine that you've worked with or know of, or are really an active dialogue, even if it's not like a verbal human dialogue, but they're an active relation with lots of other forms of life, including lives that may not be in our physical world, like spirits, or life that could be seen inanimate from a Western perspective, like sacred stones, right? Like Shiva Linga or mesas. So can you kind of tell me a little bit about some of the people, some of the stories you've gathered or have told of those who practice a relational way of life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel so lucky that in my work as a filmmaker and kind of in my previous work where I studied kind of cultural anthropology and the anthropology of economy, I got to meet people whose experience and priorities very much were in touch with kind of an expansive idea of what life is and means. For the film work that I've gotten to do, many people come to mind. I guess maybe I'll give two. I'll talk about two films, and who both kind of you mentioned kind of the life in stones, for example, and that's very clear, and especially the last two films I've made. But in one film called The Seer and the Unseen that Shane also produced, that I directed, that tells the story of an Icelandic woman named Raka Jónsdóttir, who's an Icelandic woman and a seer who is in communication with Iceland's spirits of nature. And the story revolves around her kind of journey in trying to kind of save this community inhabited by elves who live in the lava rocks in Iceland's just kind of majestic wilderness. There's a particular moment where this boulder that's believed to be kind of like an elf church, so to speak, is threatened by the building of a completely unnecessary road. And for people who don't necessarily share this understanding that spirits of nature live in stones like this, they might just observe an inert rock. But for Raka and people who are able to not just see, but also might not see, but can believe or do believe, this rock, this huge boulder is a sacred place imbued with life. So that the film kind of focuses on many different things, but kind of the moving and of the stone provides the climactic scene for this film. And kind of one of the thesis statements of the film is when Raka says at the end, the way you see the land determines your relationship to the land. And for her, she sees life in all things, and that orients her way and kind of treating the world, nature with deep respect, because she understands the life in all things. And in our other film, in Fire of Love, it's the story of French volcanologists Katja and Maurice Kraft, who have a deep understanding of the life cycle of rocks. And while many people might look at a rock and just see a rock in its solid form, they understand that a rock can come from molten lava, which is dynamic. It hardens into stone, can be pulverized into dust, and then reform again into another kind of rock. And so what they say is that there's a life cycle there too. They see the life force. And they're using very kind of scientific terms, which many people think are devoid of like cultural or spiritual language, but actually there's a continuity there between how Raka sees, a rock and life in the rock, and how these scientists also see the life force there too. I'm very moved by that. I think that has the power, that kind of way of seeing life in all things has the power to combat these deeply damaging and violent notions that humans are somehow separate from nature. Thinking like that, I could go on and on and on about the history of that type of thought and its colonial roots. But I believe that stories have the potential to instead reposition the continuity of life and the deep ecological nature of our connectedness. And that's something that in a small way we hoped to do through The Seer and the Unseen and Fire of Love, just in these very different yet somehow resonant stories.
It's really interesting. So in a way, it sounds to me a little bit like bringing back the sacred, bringing back the magical, kind of reintroducing a sense of faith and almost reintroducing mythology into our lives. I mean, does that resonate with the way you see that in the ways you've been making these films?
Oh, absolutely. I'm so moved by how people express kind of the power of nature in their everyday lives. And I think that tropes of myth and allegory can particularly do that. There's an Icelandic writer, Andri Snær Magnusson, whose work I really love, and he often talks about how difficult it is to communicate these grand challenges of our time. For example, most people hear the term the climate crisis and they kind of tune out, and he tries to interrogate like why and what is needed in order to, as he puts it, scale up language to meet the needs of these scaled up issues. And he talks about the power of poetry and myth as kind of these like magnifiers of communication. And that's something that I've definitely tried to learn more about in the appropriate cultural contexts, of course, and work with in the films that we make.
To the sort of response or the comment that some may make, well, that's an amazing story about, a beautiful romance and almost the wildness of a French couple who believe in the energetic power of volcanoes, and their love is connected to the circulatory energy of the volcano. Or this is a story of as you said, a seer or seers, in Iceland who, and, well, maybe elves exist there, but I'm here in suburbia, or I'm here in I live in a life that's feels so much more mundane and so much more mechanical than such. How do you draw those bridges to people, given how otherworldly, in a sense, yet deeply worldly these stories are?
I think that my and our, I think, like article of faith, to use that word, is that if people feel and understand that nature and this entire world is alive, we'll have more of a sense and a responsibility to want to love it. And if we have more of a sense to love it, we'll want to care for it. And if we have a sense of wanting to care for it, then we're also caring for ourselves and caring for each other and doing something about this climate crisis and many of the other crises we're living with. I think once you have that sort of sense and you move from that point, there's this feeling that you can tell stories to show that, and to not try and manipulate or impose that idea, but just show the possibility that that's true, or that's one possibility to experience, and what does it feel like to experience that. I think a lot of people talk about, there's a lot of ways to understand the aliveness of a plant or of a rock. You can think of it like Peter Singer, where like if something is capable of feeling suffering, then that's what makes it alive, and that's what makes it like worthy of our care and concern. Or you can think of it like my friend Ash Fury. They think that an object or has a will or a volition, and if something has a will or volition, that has to be understood or respected, and that's a stone rolling down the hill, or it's a mountain transforming over thousands of years. And once you see these processes and see things not just in a biological lifespan or a paradigm that centers and privileges human experience, and then within human experience, certain human experience, I think you start to feel that there's this connectivity in life that is worthy of attention, worthy of respect, worthy of love and care.
Sarah, you want to add to that?
Well, beautifully said. I'm quite moved by what Shane just expressed. I definitely agree with that, and I would also say that volcanoes, are incredibly remote for a lot of people. There are many people who live in relationship with volcanoes around the world. The vast majority of our planet, though, people do not live close to volcanoes. However, magma does course under our feet at all times, and so there actually is that connectedness there. Plate tectonics are shifting beneath our feet, fault lines are moving, and so even though we don't necessarily feel an earthquake every day, the fact is there is that activity happening, so it definitely takes a leap of imagination. Shane kind of touched on this idea of time span, and I think that an understanding of geologic time, for example, these earth processes are also time based on ancestors, that kind of culturally inherited knowledge and the memories that are shared throughout time. These things can pull the perspective out of an individual's lifespan, and put it in that processual paradigm, and that can kind of foster a kind of interconnectivity between things. But also just say, like for Raka in Iceland, the elf church that she worked hard to save actually took place next to a highway in a suburb, and it's the kind of place where if you drive by and you don't know you might not think anything of it. But I remember after our experience in Iceland and working with her on our film, we drove by once, and I remember seeing some trash there. There's like a juice box on the elf church, and we parked, and I was so livid. We ended up picking up the trash everywhere, and it made me just think, I want to care about all places, all little spots beside a highway the same way. I want to be that angry when I see trash, because I know that all life is sacred, all landscapes are sacred. So I hope that in some way, storytelling that can recenter the aliveness of nature could foster that sort of care in other people, even when it might just be a mundane place that they think might be devoid of life.
It's almost as if what we may consider mundane is actually us sort of socially constructing the mundane, by setting up sort of filters or having habits, or just not having enough time or space or energy to either look up, look below, look around, look at what is creating, everything around us, which actually is full of energy. It's full of life. Like, so in a sense, there's a certain kind of, I feel a sense of humility and awe as you speak about the power of magma, the power of the igneous, in a way that's similar to how I feel when I consider the cosmos. It's sort of about looking in a deepened way outside of sort of frames that make us think of life as lacking of magic, lacking of the animate. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is another thing that one of my friends, Jeremy Zelka, I think talks about a lot, is that you need slack in the system in order for that system to work. And I think there's a lot of pressures that force us to always be prioritizing efficiency and motion and action. And those can be very useful and beneficial for a lot of reasons, but there's also a sort of requirement of stopping, of pausing, considering, having space for awe, having space for reflection. And that can be subversive in our world in a way. And beyond that, it's just unto itself such experientially for me, just one of the most important and beautiful things possible. That action of stopping action, of non-action. And I think when that happens, so much life opens up, and there's a rush of life and a reception of it and an encountering of it, and an awareness of sort of a oneness with that life, being a part of it, of all that's happening while you're thinking of all the things you're supposed to be doing. When you can start to tap into that and really, really be with it, I think there is a deepened experience of life, and that transcends just an individual life.
And it seems like a huge part of that practice is having that space or that energy or that slack, as you just said, Shane, to notice and look, or let it come to you, more deeply listen. And, I'm sort of saying this to you, looking out my window and noticing how the light is refracting off of the trees right outside my window right now. I don't think I would have noticed that if I wasn't having this conversation with you both. Okay, so now I wanted to ask you now about where we may be heading, at least on some levels in our world, in Western culture, maybe on a more planetary culture, where increasingly, our lives are we're sort of turning to opaque technologies and systems of ordering, of almost like biopolitics, in a sense that use the past, but not the deep past, not the geologic past, not the kind of anthropological past, not the ecological past, but they use historical data, patterns of historical data, to kind of construct and create and supposedly ideate the future. So here I'm speaking about, obviously, examples like GPT-4. That has been something I've used, and I've noticed how it's sort of repeating mass patterns, but those patterns are very poorly, or they're not really deeply excavated patterns of the past. It's not history, but it's mimicry. And so I'm wondering what that means and what that stands for relative to the creative practice of being a storyteller, because many would argue that these systems are creative.
I think that so many systems, at least in my relatively uneducated about this topic perspective, systems of data often reflect the sociopolitical world in which they have emerged and been created. And I know that the data that's available is largely has been generated by certain perspectives that are that reflect extreme inequities, specifically in the U.S. And there's a real danger there to continue to reproduce those same inequities based on this data without critical interrogation or adding to the data subsets. I know there's been a lot of experiments done by asking, AIs to replicate, when a certain very damaging term. For example, I know there was an experiment saying show imagery of what a quote unquote thug is, and the AIs provided images of largely Black people, and that is extremely dangerous to continue to have that somehow be set as a norm for such a damaging word. And so that's, all to say, I feel like that's something that should not just be like there's a depoliticizing element to data. It's seen as somehow objective, and that's not at all the case. And so tremendous work needs to be done in order to account for those inequities and create pictures of our dynamic and ever-changing world that that can undo the damage of this data, so it doesn't continue.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm not an expert in the issue. I mean, you're the one I would ask these questions to, actually. But I think that there, as Sara was saying, you can't take the politicization out of a tool, and I would see these systems as tools, and those tools and technologies are rooted in human behavior and in the desire of those who make them, and that has to be taken into account when we use these tools. I do think that the tools are not simply, like ChatGPT, for instance, is not simply a reflection of existing data. I do think the interesting thing about it is that it's attempting to mimic a more synthetic understanding of information. And that's why it produces not just an accurate reflection of information that it pulls from the internet. It actually synthesizes it into new and into novel ways, sometimes creating useful responses, sometimes creating hallucinations that are massively inaccurate, and then oftentimes perpetuating a system of synthesizing information that is reflective of those who create it and the political agendas of those who create it. Having said that, I don't think it's impossible that these tools, like the internet or like other technologies, can be used for creative or generative ends. However, they can be used for those, and they can be used for anything else under the sun. And so I think that's where it becomes, and it's an interesting conversation about how do we deal with this technology, and how do we deal with any technology when it has all of those capacities.
Yeah, complex patterns. I mean, patterns can have emergent effects.
Yeah.
In terms of so-called complex outcomes, or they call complex adaptive systems. But as a mode of mimicking the human experience, especially the experience of the practice of real creativity, deepened look at history, non-human history, and that notion of care and compassion that we've already started talking about, that's not at all what these are about. In fact, Naomi Klein wrote a piece for The Guardian recently, said, and I'm just paraphrasing, saying, these AI systems are not hallucinating, but their makers are. I guess the sort of follow-up question I wanted to ask you both about is, we're having this conversation while the Writers Guild is striking, which I'm in total solidarity with. A huge part of the strike is the concern, from what I understand, of writing jobs, creative storytelling work, which is an artistic practice as well as a form of subsistence for many, are potentially to be replaced by these systems. So, any comments you have on that? And then the other area that I'd love for us to talk a little bit about, or your 2 cents on, is how even data itself borders a deeper reflection, because it takes something that's experiential and it quantifies it. And whether that's a sort of way of actually restricting a deepened way of looking at something in relation to yourself and everything else. So those two thoughts. One is about what's going to happen with writers and creative writing, these issues, and what is distinct about being a creative writer than what a system like this may do. And second, this issue of taking life and in a corporate, privatized, state-based way. Obviously that's problematic, but just even representing life merely through numbers.
I mean, I really loved Clara and the Sun. Have you read that book yet? Yeah.
I know of it, but I actually want to read it. So tell us about it.
Kazuo Shigeru's book. It's really incredible. And I think one of the things that I drew from that book is the notion that um, we may be able to, he poses that we may be able to reflect an individual experience through data, that we can actually collect every experience and present it. And you could mimic one person and you might not be able to tell one person, a human from an AI. Like they could respond to your email in exactly the same way and we wouldn't be able to differentiate it. However, our capacity to love another human, how we love that individual can never be mimicked. That experience can never be contained by data and can never exist in a construct that can happen outside of anyone's individual sort of like soulful human, very animal experience. And I think there's a truth in that. And I think that will be reflected in how people create using these tools as well. I think you may be able to type into chat GPT, like exactly ask it to tell you exactly the joke that's needed in this moment based on the person that you want it to sound like. But that also requires the human creative input of that prompt in a way. And that prompt can't be replicated by another AI in the same way that a human will be able to prompt it. And so I think there will be an increasing use of these tools to generate content, but the talent and the creativity of the artist will use this tool as they use all the other tools at their disposal to generate and create. And the tool isn't neutral, of course. Like the tool can create things back, and that's also there will be an education required for all of us to how to understand what's prompted back and the biases implicit in that. So there's a lot to happen, but my hope is that at least in the short term, there will still be the importance of creatives and storytellers and writers will still be very important. At the same time, like I think it's quite clear. I stand like as you do in solidarity with the writers and with all of their. We're not a part of the guilds, but completely in solidarity with their requests and what they're fighting for, and in a future where creative people and labor in general is respected and where they are where their work is like honored as a part of the human experience.
Sarah, any thoughts?
Oh, I just think that was beautiful what Shane said about the experience of love, as well as the artistry and creativity of the writer in deploying these tools. So I don't think I could add much to that. I'll maybe just share an experience I've had with other filmmaker friends. We often keep hearing about kind of the tyranny of the algorithms that dictate a lot of choices that are made by distributors, who will often say, well, our algorithm says we need more true crime or more celebrity biopic type of stories because that's what the data is dictating works for our audiences. And that just limits creativity to such a profound degree. And I often also feel I have some friends who are executives at some of these companies who themselves get really frustrated. It's their mandate to use this algorithm, even when they themselves, don't agree. They like other types of stories and storytelling. So I just really worry about, again, what feels like a kind of tyranny of data that, of course, is driven by this direct feedback of, eyeballs that translates into money. But it's my hope that thinking expansively and outside of that will really benefit just the flows of creativity and storytelling moving forward.
So now for a wildcard question, I'm curious. We've talked about love, and love as I guess what we can all double down on, and really the topic and theme and so much of both your work independently, I know, and as well as together. So let's talk about love. How does love manifest in your life? How does love manifest in your creative work? what does love mean and signify right now at a time when it feels like there's at least these constructs of division and polarization and judgment seem to be all around us, whether they are really true or being fabricated to manipulate us all. Let's talk a little about love.
That's such a great, I'll just say that as you've asked that question, I noticed my body changing. Like I noticed like this physical feeling of like my heart expanding and just like warmth taking over. And I think in a very small way that signifies just the utter transformative power of love. And that can be extrapolated in so many different forms. A long time ago, many years ago, I remember confiding to Shane about some frustrations I was having with a colleague. And Shane very wisely told me that in his practice, he tries to reserve a little piece of his heart for loving everyone. And that can transform his orientation towards conflict, towards people. And I remember being so moved by that. That was something I actively started to try to do, and it really did shift things. That orientation, it didn't kind of erase kind of the frustrations necessarily, but it conjured a sense of empathy and a deeper understanding towards conflict, where I just felt like I changed into a different stance. It was a stronger stance, perhaps, that allowed me to have more understanding for both myself and really kind of what I was looking for, what I was after, what I felt and believed in, as well as meeting that other person. And I felt like that opened up the space for dialogue in a way where perhaps before I would have been more defensive or shut down. And so I'm so grateful for that paradigm, as well as how it kind of puts in relationship love and understanding. There's a line in Fire of Love that was inspired by the work of Thich Nhat Hanh, where Thich Nhat Hanh says, "Understanding is love's other name." And I think that's like something that I will forever be grateful for and forever do my best to practice and to see the relationship between those things.
Understanding is love's other name. Huh? That's very interesting. Okay, Shane, please, yeah. And I want to ask about attachment as well.
Yeah, I think, Sarah, your first response is I share that. Just when asked to consider it, when asked with such sincerity from you, Ramesh, like I feel it bodily, and that's just such a beautiful sign and indicator. I also think for me, my way of understanding it is that to start by saying, like, I love this world, I love my life, I love this life, but I don't love everything in this world. I don't love everything about this life that I live. But yet I still love it. And when I know this, I also can extrapolate that to another person, to any other person, in a way that I necessarily won't love everything about them, but they are more than that. They are more than that quality that I don't love. And because they are more than that, and because there's more about them that I love than I don't love, I love them. And it's not an equation like that, but I start from that big principle, from that sort of like bigger, wider love, and a different understanding of what the unit is that we love, and that unit is really big, and that also that person is not just who they are. That person is every experience they've ever had, their ancestors, the air they breathe, the grass they walk on. Like, when you start to understand it in this way, it becomes much easier, not to understand everyone exactly or specifically, but to have a desire for greater understanding and a desire for greater love. And oftentimes that generates a sensation and a feeling of love. And I think when that is generated and when that is embodied and shared in your every fiber and every action, I think that's just a more beautiful and true reflective of what is most deep to me in this world way to live. And so that's the every day, every second, every instant ambition of recognizing a sense that all is love, and that everything is deserving of love.
When I came to see Fire of Love, I was sort of in an anxious state. I was didn't know anybody there. I didn't want to bother you, Shane. You know, I've known Shane for, I don't know, 15 to 20 years at least, something like that. It could be around that, could be 20 years, Shane.
Yeah.
And then I watched the movie, and I felt connected. I felt like I was part of a community. I felt like connected to the characters and the story and the magic of it all, and it gave me a sense of sort of love of the environment and the experience I was having. So that's a sort of obtuse way of asking you, how do you maintain that love and that spirit navigating the business aspects of being in an industry and now being very successful also within it? And how are you continuing to bring that into your current work?
First, I feel so lucky and inspired to work with people that I love. I'm constantly inspired by my collaborators, including deeply Shane. I think that I feel really lucky that in storytelling, despite like all the stress, despite the structural frustrations and inequities of our, the filmmaking industry, and of course all industries, I feel so lucky that curiosity really is something that I get to harness on a day-to-day basis. And I think the curiosity that brings me in contact with new ideas, with new ways of seeing the world, feels like a kind of love to me. There's just kind of like this like brain tingling excitement that I get, that I guess kind of like fills me up and feels like transcendence. And I think particularly film being a medium of sound and image, there's the potential for so much play and joy to spark that. And I think there's almost like a feedback cycle. I feel like if there's an idea that's inspiring, I can like share it with Shane and then hear his thoughts, and it draws us closer. You become bonded to the people that you work with. And yeah, I feel like that can, foster an even deeper kind of love and understanding. But so things like that feel like a medicine for me, in this quite challenging industry that we're in. Doesn't mean every idea of ours is going to find funding or financing or a distribution home. But I feel lucky that there are a lot of conversations that at least can provide inspiration as we kind of explore what projects might be possible.
Yeah, I think, in some ways, like we're answering questions, but you're actually in the really beautiful seat of asking questions. And I think that's sort of the driving force of all of what we do is approaching it with not knowing, approaching it with that curiosity that Sarah's talking about. And that fuels the necessity of humility. Like, to do anything that we're doing, you have to sort of approach it without knowing the answer, and with wanting to get closer and closer to more understanding without ever fully understanding. And so I think when you recognize that and inhabit that, hopefully we have a better chance of staying humble in the face of all of this. And I think the other quality relates a little bit to what I was saying before about just the interconnectedness of all life in a way. When you recognize that anything you do is a result of every experience you've ever had, every person whose life has ever touched you, everyone who's come before you, you can really deeply and fully realize that when you succeed, it's not you succeeding, and therefore you can love everyone else. And when you fail, when you don't accomplish what you set out to accomplish, it's not really you failing, so you can love yourself. And I think when you can contain that and hold that, you really hopefully can stay in tune with your values, your sense of integrity, and not get swept up in any of the other like carrots that are dangled in front of you that you're supposedly supposed to care about more.
Yeah, it's as if what we describe as the self or the individual, which is, our current digital world and our just sort of current like kind of late capitalist world is one of a lot of individuation, right? But actually, the individual or even the self is actually, like a bunch of sediment, like layers of sedimentation. Going back to the geologic volcanic theme of your work. I mean, of Fire of Love and other things. So I guess this is to ask where. So now the two of you, I believe, are working on a new film, and maybe you're working on your own projects. And can you share whatever it is you feel comfortable sharing about that and how it's picking up on where Fire of Love may have left you or other projects may have left you? So I'd love to hear about that from each of you.
Sure. Yeah. So we actually we're starting a project that was brought to us that has some resonant themes with Fire of Love. But we're paused at the moment. We're still doing a little bit of research, but we're paused on the writing process at the moment in solidarity with the writer's strike, even though we're not part of the guild. But briefly, that's a story of love and loss and meaning told through the experience of a biologist who studies a tiny water animal called the hydra that many scientists believe possesses the secrets to immortality. And it's about his kind of relationship with the hydra and an existential kind of crisis and quest that he goes on when this question of like, could life be everlasting is literally thrust in front of him.
So the potential secret to immortality is not in the mega, it's in the micro.
Exactly. Yeah, we feel so lucky that in making Fire of Love we got to just revel in Katya and Maurice Kraft's imagery of volcanoes that felt so cosmic. They were deeply earthly, the stuff that the earth is made of, yet they felt so almost celestial in their kind of transcendent beauty. And just in looking at imagery of hydra, these tiny water animals that are a quarter of an inch big, and seeing them in the ecology of kind of pond life, it's mesmerizing. It has the same kind of awe and power and that cosmic beauty that volcanoes or stars also have. And also just to know that hydra live everywhere. There's hydra in most bodies of water around the world. So the secrets to immortality are underfoot. That mere notion is quite powerful. So it's been very inspiring just to think about those things. Very different from Fire of Love, but getting to play again with themes of meaning, existentialism, life. Also the politics of life. Many people would think they hear immortality and biopharma, there's all kinds of capitalistic interpretations of what that life could be. But instead, we're very much interested in centering something else that can transcend that kind of categorization and capitalization.
Yeah, and I think, we deal with it. It's an important theme, and it's an important theme in Fire of Love, and will certainly be an important theme of this, is just dying, how we understand death, and that it's such a it's really undertended to. I think it's such an important part of life, and how we understand our life, whether or not we're running away from death or we're accepting death as a part of life. Are we trying to elongate life or deepen life? Like, all of this is dependent upon what we think of death. And so I'm very excited to continue that work and to continue to center that experience as central to life.
So connected also to this podcast, given that, in a future episode, I'll be in conversation with Roshi Joan Halifax, who wrote the book Standing at the Edge, all about death as a transmission, death as sort of a new life, right? Like, there's not even because of an attachment, but because the sort of mystery of death is actually what's sacred in life, in a sense. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and what that when you are able to touch that wisdom, it changes how you think of all moments as what beginnings and ends change, and transitions, transformations, movement, growth become new paradigms to experience life with. And so I think I'm very curious to hear how Joan Halifax will answer the same question.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think there's interesting work now out there that at least I'm sort of musing upon or reflecting upon that looks at the distinctions between human life in relation to other forms of life, including, like as we discussed earlier, like stones or sticks that are witnessing or that have been the home for life, right? Like the example you gave from Iceland earlier, Sarah. That's one model, right? Like seeing ourselves as parts of webs of life, chains of other forms of life. And then there's this other, so there's that's sort of one mode of projection. And then there's this other, which is sort of this mode of projection of self into pattern, inert, I don't know if I want to say sterile, but sort of flattening technology, right? And so, in sort of for fun, sometimes I watch philosophy lectures a lot in the evening. I think I've told you about this, Shane. And I was watching a lecture by Donna Haraway, right? I'm a colleague of mine at UC Santa Cruz. I've been on editorial boards with her. And she often speaks of being of the world, like being of the world, worlding, is kind of a term she uses. And she gives examples of scientists who are very interested, for example, in whooping cranes. It's like so cool. But because the whooping crane also is connected to many like sort of chains of life, right? But the way they are engaging with the whooping crane isn't by capturing it, containing it, incarcerating it, sterilizing it, grabbing data from it, but actually by being whooping cranes themselves. The scientists sort of try to perform as part of a sort of community with whooping cranes to sort of as a mode of rehabilitation, as a mode of understanding through a relationship with the cranes rather than the capture and extraction of the crane, right? So I just wonder how you feel about that point that I'm making, whether as filmmakers and artists you feel like you can continue or want to try to tell those sorts of stories, or if that's what this new project in a sense is about. This biologist you mentioned who is working with hydras.
I love that example. That's a beautiful and moving, I think, new paradigm, or perhaps it's an old paradigm that's being brought into this moment that I think really has that power again to do the repair of this like deep and violent chasm that's been fabricated between humans and nature. So I would love to continue to work on stories exactly like that, which don't seek to kind of be a form of conquering nature in that way, like the kind of scientific method that you described of like capturing and extracting. There's such violence in that. And yeah, stories that continue and make visible the ecological relations are of that most power right now. And so I do hope that this new project that we're working on, very much celebrating and honoring the work that of this biologist and other are people that are working in this way. Of course, it's a true story that we'll be interpreting for cinematic purposes. But I hope whether it's that film or the other ones that we're continuing to dream up will be rooted in that paradigm. So yeah.
I wanted to then ask about some of the, I guess we'll say history, some of your past in taking you to this place. I mean, Shane, I've admired you and looked up to you actually, and for many, many years. Shane is, close to my brother Mahesh, and that's actually how I originally met you. And I remember when I first met you, kind of being like, just being sort of like, wow, how is he so sort of silent and humble and taking things in and slow in a sense, even though you're very fast and brilliant in your brain when you wish to be and on the tennis court. But so Shane, I would love to hear a little about your own sort of practice and ways of being, whatever you feel open to sharing on a personal level, and also about some of your time all around the world, including studying and spending time in India. I've randomly met friends of Shane's on multiple continents, including in Bamako, Mali. I met one of Shane's friends who's like a drummer in a Mauritanian rock band. I mean, it's like, and somehow Shane is our point of connection. And I know, Sara, that there are many that this is a question I'm going to ask you also about your own history, because I can sense that energy and care and love in both of you. And I sensed it even, when I met you, just you, Sara, and so I want to hear about where that comes from, where it's all heading for you. So we'll start with you, Shane.
I think there's ways to understand sort of our paths in retrospect and to make sense of it. But I don't think I knew. I can say a lot of things to try and make sense of it now, but I'm not sure that I knew any of that while I was living. And I can say the same thing about this moment, that I have a sense of what I'm doing now and what I want to do in the future. And then when I look at it and when I look at it from the perspective of the future, I'm sure I'll be like, that's completely not how I understand it now is completely not how I understood it then. So with that caveat, I think that I was always just, even starting in middle school or high school, I think the thing that most excited me was listening to the world, or listening to my friends, and trying to understand what moved them, like, and what was singular about them, and to hear their vision and their hopes and aspirations, and to just be with them in trying to understand what those visions and dreams were, and then see if there was something we can do to help move closer to actualizing those visions and dreams. And so I think I started by doing it with just any person that would hang out with me, and if they wanted to be a musician, then I was working in music. If they wanted to, if they wanted to be an entrepreneur, I was helping them with the business they were setting up. Or if it was someone who was like deeply committed to the nonprofit work they were doing, I was just like hearing their values and trying to understand the landscape of what was possible, and working with them. And I eventually did that with a filmmaker, and there seems to be a role for that I could play. And so I started to do that more and more with films, and started to gain a few more of the maybe concrete skills or capacity for tasks that are required in that role. But it sort of originated from that just intuitive excitement and joy from working with people on what they love and care about. And so that brought me, through so many different conspiring circumstances that brought me to do my graduate work in India, in New Delhi at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And there is where I met my first film producer, and that would launch into film work. And it was there that I met some of the most like brilliant and incredible people in my life, that I could do the same work in whatever humble way I could. And then I came back to the States, and I sort of didn't I didn't have a home for 10 years or 15 years. I didn't rent a place. I didn't have a permanent address. I was really just bopping from place to place, working in whatever like small ways I could, with people that I cared about, and on projects that they cared about, and that I in turn started to care about. And I saw, and you mentioned time in Plum Village, and I saw that one of the most important ways, I don't think I used it as in a utilitarian sense, or a utility sense, that like being present and adopting certain practices would help me do this work. But I saw this all as part of the work, and started to see my life, no matter what I was doing, as the art or as the work. And I think part of traveling so much and working on so many other people's incredible projects and of their incredible lives, compelled me to need a little bit of a home, and that home was not in space but in time. And so I started to carve out a 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours every morning, where those would be filled with space and practice and presence, that felt like home, that could allow me to travel the rest of the day to various people's worlds and to various like physical locations and do that work that I cared really deeply about.
It's almost as if you're setting aside that time every morning to just sort of occupy and be in your own. Is that how you see it? I mean, I know, we've talked over the years about how in the morning you'll be silent and you'll do a sort of silent walking meditation, often at extremely early hours of the morning where I'm almost always asleep and I definitely need coffee. But would you share a little more about that? Because I think it's very unique and very interesting.
Yeah, I tend for a lot of years now, I just tend to wake up with the light, and as daybreak comes, I'll either sit or I'll walk or I'll do a more physical practice. A more body, heart, mind, soul practice, and connection to the world as well. And I find that just helps me. That helps me feel in tune, and I think when I feel in tune, I can help tune to others, and I love that feeling, and I feel that's a expression of whatever small gifts I have or I want to give in this world, and giving our gifts, whatever they are, to me is just like a beautiful way to try and live. And that's the hope, that's the attempt, a humble work in progress that I can so much improvement and so much growth to do on all of this, but that's part of it.
Can you take us, Shane? And I'll ask you, Sarah, in a moment. Can you take us, Shane, to where or when or how, when you were young, where this sort of seed started? Is this from your family? When I'm saying this seed, using very Buddhist language, but in Thai, Thich Nhat Hanh type language, but just the practice or the desire to sort of having, now we call it mindfulness and so on, but that deeper kind of desire for presence, for mindfulness, and also for karuna, compassion. When or how did this come into being? This is actually, I've never known this and always been curious. So.
Yeah, again, I don't know. I know that certainly, I don't think my family didn't have the word compassion, but I think kindness was an ethic from very early on that was instilled and demanded. And I think that it may stem from there. Like I think that the hope of all of the work we're doing, I think, is for more love, more compassion. And when you start from a place that more love and more compassion is what you're going for, you try and figure out what can help you be more loving, what can help you be more compassionate. And so I think all of our practices, our spirituality, divinity, that's all rooted in, I think, from everything I've learned and also from everything I've experienced, it's rooted in more love and compassion for one another and for totality. And so maybe there was definitely influences from family. I did read. I got lucky enough to be exposed to Thich Nhat Hanh when I was 16, and several other sort of deeply philosophical, spiritual, mystical. Just maybe the word wise is all that's required. Wise people from really young, and that was really helpful, and also grateful for my friends who like first took me out into the sand dunes in Utah and Colorado, and allowed me to just like be alone with the world and to hear it and to feel it. And I think that was one of the most, that was and continues to be the most profound teacher.
And part of that sort of like love of the world is not actually avoiding this what sometimes people call spiritual bypassing, like where you are like, oh no problems, it's all love, kind of like papering it over, which it can be a very elite practice and an unconscious practice. So it's almost as if that sort of path of deepened love, which you're devoting your work to, your creative work and your energy to, Shane, is connected to the suffering that so many of us have, from pandemics to the rise of fascism in the US to the ecological issues. It's pretty heavy, right? So how are those connected for you?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that is an origin. That is an origin of all of this. I think it's when you none of what I'm talking about can exist unless there is a deep resonance and feeling, sensation, reaction to suffering, and a feeling that there is a path to try to alleviate some of that unnecessary suffering. But in order for that to happen, of course, you have to recognize that there is suffering and accept it and feel it, and also accept that nothing you can do, and that there will always be work to be done in this. And I don't think that's theoretical. I think that's just being awake to the world and having open eyes and heart. You start to feel that suffering, and you start to carry with you, I think, also perhaps a naive or a naivete of just that, like, it doesn't have to, what is doesn't always have to be that way. That there is an agency, and there is a sense that those things that cause suffering are there for so many reasons. There's so many causes behind the cause that create suffering. And if we can like look to that and make that a point of our like ultimate concern and our consideration and our work, yeah, maybe we have a chance to do something with that. And I think that's like so much of the films we make, as you are alluding to, and so much of the work we do is about those who are fighting against authoritarianism, or those who are fighting against corrupt systems, or unjust notions of like Western or white supremacy, and really looking at those films and really looking at those stories and trying to give what we have to give to those, so that we can call attention to those and move through them.
So almost like suffering and injustice as the foundation for a deeper practice of care and love and compassion, right? Rather than us starting and ending with the suffering and injustice, and then being stuck in these sort of hamster wheels of distrust, of a feeling of being voiceless. Sara, how about you? So, I know no one's story is the same, right? All of our stories are different from one another, but you looking at, that some of the films you've worked on over the years and your own work as an artist, storyteller, that there's something very powerful that I sense, or Intuit has been growing with you for over time. So please share whatever as you feel fit, as you feel comfortable about your own history and some of the markers that are making you who you are and who you continue to be.
Sure. Well, thank you for those kind words. I think for me, I am extremely close with my mother. I feel very lucky to have an extremely close relationship with her. She remains my hero. I talk to her usually many times a day. She's now retired, but she was a professor of cultural anthropology. And she specifically studied systems of gender and class, and looked at the ways that economic systems facilitated and fostered relations of power, and the meanings within that. And so I was raised in a family where there is these conversations happening at our dinner tables, and that I think predisposed me to have like an orientation towards looking at systems of meaning and power and how dynamic those systems are. Not, they're never static, they're ever changing, and an interplay between structure and agency, and so much more. So I grew up kind of thinking I would follow in her footsteps and be a professor of anthropology. And at once, ever since I was very little, I was like obsessed with poetry. I loved to read poetry, I loved to write poetry, I journaled constantly. And a lot of my journaling was also fueled by this perhaps like overly romantic notion about capturing time. I still remember a journal that my mother gave me when I was a teenager had this, a quote from Anais Nin at the front that said, "We write to taste life twice, in the moment and in retrospection." And I thought to myself, I was like, wow, there's this magical way where I can like relive this life that I feel so lucky to live, like all the time, if I just write it all down. And that kind of conjured this almost like obsessive practice of writing in me. And so I feel so lucky to have found my way into filmmaking, because I feel like the methodologies, especially of nonfiction work, can often bring in anthropological frameworks that look at meaning and the interrogation of systems of power. And at once, I feel like I get to kind of draw upon my love of poetry to find ways that can creatively express how people interpret and make meaning. I feel like documentary kind of serendipitously has become a form through which these loves from a young age that also honors the work of my mom. I have my dream job, so to speak. And I feel like if there's any kind of through line, it's from those influences.
So inspiring. It's also great to know that that a fellow professor and your mother can be such a source of inspiration on so many other levels than merely like the mind and the intellect and the brain and the thought forms and all of this, but in terms of really the things she stands for. And is your mom she's anthropology professor at UC Berkeley, is that right?
She was many years ago, and then she's taught at other universities since, but she retired a while ago now. But she's like my personal professor. On every film we work on, I'll always ask her for feedback, and will give us all kinds of notes, creative notes, but also be like, no, actually, in a neo-Marxist sense, this is, she's very quick with the paradigms, and we'll always look to her for counsel.
The seer in her own right? The seer. I love that you started our conversation with the word seer. I found that's been kind of circling in my brain since when my last book came out, I did a podcast episode with Ralph Nader, and I didn't realize that. I mean, it was amazing. He was just like, you have all these dreamy ideas. How are you going to implement it? There's 400 people in Congress. How are you going to get like 300 something to support these ideas? I loved it. But then he mentioned to me that his sister, and I forgotten that his sister Laura Nader because he's actually partly Lebanese, right? And it had actually worked in the Oaxaca region of southern Mexico, literally in the same areas, Zapotec communities, indigenous communities that I've been learning from for several years. So it was really cool to hear about how he also is inspired and influenced by his anthropologist sister. So this gives me some hope for the academy, and this podcast is so much about taking the best of the academy, I hope, and being in a larger sangha, a larger community with storytellers like yourselves, like artists and more. So final question for each of you. Well, this is a quick one, and then I'll just end with like one closing quick question, which is, biggest inspirations for each of you on whether it's books or films or filmmakers or TV shows. TV shows have gotten so much better over the last decade or so. Very interesting. Video games could be that. So each of you, biggest influences on you, past, present. Who are you looking up to, and what are you looking up to?
Well, there's so many to name. Miranda July, who she was our narrator in Fire of Love, and she's an artist whose work I deeply, deeply admire. I think that, she's a multi-hyphenate artist who's always looking for novel formats to express her creativity. And I think that she's able to put in direct relationship kind of the personal and the political in ways that can feel so expansive. And she's just so herself. She's like, there's such a singularity to her voice and her vision as an artist that it somehow magically also seems so relatable. And artists that are able to be so intimate with their work, there's such generosity there. And so I'm really moved by her way of making work and sharing her gifts with the world. So I'll just mention her. There's so many though that come to mind, but I'm personally just really grateful too for her collaboration with us on Fire of Love.
And I really appreciate that, because I was actually going to ask you about the experience of working with Miranda, because Miranda was a fantastic narrator to the film. I first thought that was you, Sarah, and then I was listening, and I was like asking the person sitting next to me, "Wow, this is such good narration." That's great. So how about you, Shane?
No, I mean, I'm not saying this just because of the present company, but I mean, both of you are big inspirations for me. I think also just wanting to make it a case for friends and friendship too, like that. I think every deep for me truth that I've touched, I was pointed in that direction by a friend, by someone I loved and cared about, and a friend like Jeremy Zelka, who I mentioned earlier, and others as well, who brought me to people who are teachers and partners on the path, and who brought me to other teachers like Hazrat Inayat Khan or Thich Nhat Hanh, or who showed me the work of Krzysztof Kozlowski in film, or writers like Kazuo Ishiguro, who we mentioned earlier. Like I'm not the best, I think, at like finding all the things that resonate, or who brought me into the woods, but the people, somehow I've been able to connect with people who have showed me these things and helped me see new ways of looking at these things that I might look at in the same way every day. And I'm really grateful for all of them, and for you too.
Beautiful. Okay, final question for each of you. This podcast is called Utopias for a reason, because I want to bring back the idea of the utopia in our current, time and space, right? In the idea of a utopia as a world that might be borderless, as not just physically but also ontologically, like with other beings, other animals, spirits, etc. So in that spirit, please feel free to share with me. I mean, it's so incomplete with language itself, but sort of your vision of life and how you're trying to contribute to it, your own utopic vision, insofar as it's even appropriate. What's your faith and belief and idea of life moving forward, a new utopic vision?
It's interesting. So the first thing that comes to mind is like the project that was Esperanto, the language that was supposed
That's
to
awesome.
be. Esperanto was thought of as a utopian kind of language, a language that could take from all kinds of different systems of language to break down barriers and find a measure of connectedness. And that project, I'm certainly no scholar of Esperanto, but I know that it did not take hold, and I'm sure there was all kinds of issues with it. But I love that the prompt that it offers. And so I think all I can say is that what I love about it is it was trying to break down new systems and find new modes of connectivity. And so whatever imagination I have of utopia would be about breaking down paradigms that conjure suffering, and finding new modes of connectivity, whether they're language, whether they're ontological, whether they're multidimensional, however we could find them. But I think, again, if you think of Esperanto as a prompt, to me, that makes me think about asking questions. And I believe that whatever utopia that we could inhabit would be a place where that's more situated towards asking questions rather than in search of definitive answers.
It's a messy question, and it's something more felt. And I love that the question got us to Esperanto. How about you, Shane?
Yeah, recognizing, we've all been saying, recognizing the sentience of this planet, and a process, opening ourselves to a process of sort of clearing our mind, opening our heart, and caring for each other, and doing so because we sense and feel the difficulty and suffering, and feel a connection and a oneness with that. I think there's something inside there, and that goes to recognizing and working against the entrenched systems of power, and finding ways to be and become. I'll think about the answer for the rest of my life. That'll be my answer.
There's really no answer. It's really about a certain sense of affect and spirit, and also thoughts of different ways of changing, ways of being, as you're saying. And I think one of the, ending with love, ending with Esperanto, but also, that our conversation today is a great reminder of the power that we have as human beings, as living sentient beings who are part of a larger kind of constellation of other sentient beings, and beings that might be seen as not inanimate but are actually animated, like stones, and that in that we have the capacity to act and be, and that is right now lying right in front of us in a way that sort of sidesteps some of the trauma over-determining, trauma centered, but starting and ending with trauma narratives of life as collapsing, as us as the terrible Anthropocene, all of that, right? And so I think you both have really reminded me, even while we've been speaking, I've been able to really lock in and be present with you both, to look more deeply, to feel more deeply, to look around, look more widely, look under the earth, look to the cosmos, and look really at history, like everyone's history, right? And including non-human history. And I think it's that is really what I leave our conversation inspired by. So thank you both so much for joining me today.
Beautiful. Thanks so much.